First You Think is a not-for-profit ministry of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. Support us at ucdsm.org today.
I'm going to start telling you a story about a student that I'll call Jonah. And then I'm going to start talking to you about a story about the Jewish prophet called Jonah. And then I'm going to go back and forth between these two Jonahs. And just when you're wondering if I'm ever going to tie them together, that's when I'm going to start talking to you about a philosopher named Karl. Now, at this point, you're going to start getting annoyed with me, thinking, didn't he just stand here last week talking about the importance of clear communication? That's why I'm telling you now. And so you'll move through that, and then you'll arrive at a moment where you think, I know where he's going with this sermon. But it's not that. It's actually 30 degrees off from what you're thinking. And at the end, I hope you'll understand why we needed all three stories. In my defense, Jonah was a tenor. And please understand, finding a real tenor, a male voice that can sing high notes effortlessly, that's like spotting an orchid growing on Bell Avenue. And I needed tenors. It was my third year at a very small college of 900 students. I wish it was 900 singers. I had finally built the choir up to 30 singers, but we needed tenors. So when Jonah transferred in from another college as a sophomore in vocal performance with that kind of high voice, I had to make this work. He didn't show any training or skill or musicianship or interest or passion or really anything a teacher wanted to see, but I could fix him. In his defense, Jonah was a prophet of the Hebrew God Yahweh, and being a prophet was a tough gig. I don't know if you've ever read the prophets or the last time you've read them, Micah, Amos, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so forth. They had a tough job, right? They had to go wherever their God Yahweh sent them, and usually they had to say, stop being bad or God will destroy you. It is, I shall warn you, emotionally exhausting to read chapter after chapter of these prophets saying, repent, you horrible, horrible people. Now, the good news, at least for these prophets, is that they were 100% sure that they were right. Because, their God had given them the assignment. But inevitably, people ignore the prophet, and then Yahweh destroys them. So I like to think of the prophet's job in some ways like serving eviction notices. But instead of apartments, it's nations. And instead of evictions, it's destruction. It's a tough job. My year with Jonah started out tough. I taught Jonah in most of his classes, and here is the report after a month. Jonah didn't do anything. He came to choir sometimes, and he was completely unprepared. I think he sat around in his dorm room smoking weed, but I don't want to push it. I'm a polite Midwestern boy. I certainly don't want a conflict. So instead, I decided to play amateur psychologist. I knew that his mom was incredibly overbearing. She was emailing me every day to ask about her 20-year-old son's progress. So I thought to myself, this poor guy, I pity you. You just need a few weeks to blow off some steam from this helicopter parenting. But I can spark a fire in him to become great. I will inspire him to do his job. Now, what makes Jonah stand out from the other prophets is that he didn't do his job. Yahweh tells Ezekiel to lie on the left side of his body for 390 days in penance for Israel. That's what Ezekiel does. But Yahweh very clearly tells Jonah, go to Nineveh, to the northeast. And Jonah says, no, thank you. And he hops on a boat to go as far away as possible to the west, to Tarshish. I mean, he knew what he had to do, and his instruction came from his God, and yet he bolted. I have a little sympathy for Jonah, though. If you could imagine the ghost of Abraham Lincoln visiting you tonight and saying, I need you to go to Washington, D.C. I need you to speak out against fascist use of military forces domestically, you might get on that plane to San Diego, which is basically what Jonah did. Now, all year long, Jonah did nothing. What was I supposed to do? I didn't have a God in my ear telling me what to do, so I stuck with my plan. I will fix him. I will inspire him. And I said, in my defense, he was a tenor. In my hopes of raising the prestige of this fledgling choir, I booked the group on a trip to Germany and Austria at the end of the year. So all year long, we were preparing difficult music to sound great in these magnificent cathedrals. The students, meanwhile, were busy working at fundraising and getting their passports and figuring out how to convert dollars to euros. It was all hands on deck. All hands except Jonah. And the thing about a small choir in a small school is that your actions reverberate really quickly. The other students were getting very upset with Jonah's lack of help or preparation. He wasn't memorizing the songs. He wasn't helping with the fundraising. His colleagues were feeling hurt and frustrated. Dude, don't you get we're getting on a plane to Germany soon? So Jonah gets on the boat to Tarshish, not Nineveh. And in his defense, the prophets had a hard gig. You wouldn't want it. But obviously, Yahweh's not okay with Jonah's disobedience, so there's a giant storm in the sea. Now, the rest of the boat crew clocks pretty quickly. This isn't bad weather. This is divine rage. They take a poll, who among us has infuriated a god this week? They figure out it's Jonah. They throw him out into the sea where he's famously swallowed by a big fish. The Hebrew is big fish. I don't know where whale comes from. Anyway, the big fish does its job and takes Jonah to the shore of Nineveh and vomits him onto the shore. Fine, I'll go. I get it. You're God. I'm a prophet. I know you're right. I'll do my job. So Jonah reluctantly walks through the city of Nineveh for 3 days, delivering the message. If you don't clean up your act, Nineveh will be destroyed in 40 days. Finally, our day has arrived. The choir gathers at the charter bus, filled with excitement and anxiety and relief that all their hard work has arrived at this moment. We have our passports, we have our euros, we have our music. We don't have Jonah. So Ben, our very responsible student leader, sighs and then volunteers to head over to Jonah's room where he finds him asleep. Ben wakes up Jonah, gets him packed, gets him on the bus. As we enter the bus, one of the other singers, exhausted with all this nonsense, lets slip. What a joke. And here comes the best joke in the book of Jonah. Nineveh is not destroyed. The people actually hear Jonah's warning and they repent. So God shows mercy and everyone's happy. But Jonah finds this so annoying. You made me go to this stupid city to deliver your hammer of justice, and then you forgive them? Frankly, I'm disappointed. I'm so disappointed. That's all I could say to Ben. Ben found me the first morning in Germany to let me know that someone had stolen all of his euros out of his luggage. Should I mention at this point that Ben was the only one willing to room with Jonah? We had every reason to suspect that Jonah took Ben's money. Jonah, who surely hadn't exercised the foresight to exchange currency or even pack money. But what was I supposed to do to handle this? What did my values tell me? I was holding fast to my commitment that Jonah has inherent worth and dignity, and while I was starting to feel like it was maybe time for me to intervene, again, I didn't have a God whispering in my ear commanding me to do something. I didn't want to confront Jonah. I wanted to fix him through my faith in his worth and dignity. So instead, I took up a collection among the choir to help Ben get through the week. And then I continued on as if nothing was wrong. Now, obviously, Jonah was wrong to dodge his responsibility. But I think there's a lesson here that works across all theological perspectives. And it's this. Sometimes we know what we have to do, and we don't do it. Most of us don't have the voice of a deity over our shoulder commanding us to speak up when something's wrong. But we do have a commitment to values and covenants, and that conscience can speak as loudly as any divinity. And it says this: you know what you have to do. Do it. I often find myself, to my own surprise, referring to the book of Jonah when I'm putting off a hard conversation or a confrontation that needs to happen. I'll say to myself, I know I need to head to Nineveh on this, with this incredibly complex situation, but boy, I'd like to disappear to Tarshish. Jonah disappeared after that tour. I don't know what happened. I assume he failed out of our college. And at this point, I think the lesson you wanted me to learn, having heard this story, is that I was supposed to have intervened with Jonah. Supported him, yes, but removed him from choir because he was hurting all the other students. He was failing to meet any of our expectations. That's not the lesson I chose to learn in that moment. What I chose to learn was that I needed better singers. So 2 years later, I got a dream job at a school with over 100 voice majors. Can you imagine 100 voice majors in a room? I'll never have another Jonah, I thought, since these students are serious about singing. And they were serious about singing opera. But that is not the same thing as being serious about singing in choir. So naturally, I thought, I can fix them. I can inspire them. And year after year, we'd have these massive conflicts in the choir between the students who were doing the work and those who were showing up to do the bare minimum to meet a stupid choir ensemble requirement. So finally, one year, I said, there must be something I'm doing wrong. So I studied universities around the country with truly excellent choirs. By the way, Iowa State was one of them. I interviewed the students, I interviewed the directors, I watched how they worked. It turns out they staffed the choirs with students who were interested in doing the work required, which is sometimes different than the 50 best singers in the room. Then they would build good covenants around what they should expect of one another, and they would hold one another to these covenants with love. Even the tenors, especially the tenors. I came home from that research wide-eyed. I built a new choir full of students who wanted to be in choir, and then we made a covenant that we would hold one another to compassionately about our greed, values, and behaviors. I cannot tell you the difference it made. I can't describe it. And as I started to recognize and honor the commitment these students were making, I also started paying attention to the voice inside me that would speak up when a student was drifting away from us. Sometimes I'd intervene with that student and they would come back into the choir's covenant and do great work. I mean, one student I almost kicked out of our beginner choir. And after that conversation, 2 years later, he was the president of the advanced choir. Sometimes, as they say, the Ninevites get their act together. And yet, sometimes I did have to dismiss a student from choir when they were continuously unable to meet our expectations. But at least then they understood why they were out. This much I anticipated, but what I had not seen coming was the change in the energy in the room when there is a covenant and it's lovingly, compassionately enforced when someone falls short and won't come back. It's hard to describe that energy, but it is glorious, it is liberating. It's what belonging feels like. And that's what brings us to Karl. Karl was born in Vienna in 1902. His parents were Jewish, but they assimilated to Lutheranism like many did in the early 20th century. Karl was a brilliant learner, but boy, could he not focus on any one thing. So he went in and out of universities, like my Jonah, deciding to be a cabinet maker and then an elementary school teacher. He earned a PhD in psychology, which he then used to teach high school math. And then there was a whole series of international adventures before he settled down at the London School of Economics as a professor of logic. It's dizzying. Now, I first learned about Karl Popper about 10 years ago after the Charlottesville white supremacist march, because our national political conversation started debating how welcoming and tolerant we should be to Nazis. Speaking of Nazis, in Karl's 1945 book, and let me pause here to connect some dots. Karl Popper, born 1902, Austrian, Jewish, 1945, the year after the Nazis' fall. In Karl's 1945 book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, Karl articulated his famous paradox of tolerance. He writes, "Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them." And I would note that Karl's writing here was not philosophical, it was empirical. I describe the paradox of tolerance this way. If we say in our playground, everyone is welcome to play however they want, eventually a kid will come along who hogs the swings to themselves. And if we tolerate that kid's swing hogging, then they will take over the slide and then the sandbox. And suddenly it's not a free playground anymore. It's that kid's playground. If you welcome any behavior, including violence and bullying, you don't have a playground anymore. And this is the origin of the sentence, we welcome everyone who welcomes everyone. The paradox of tolerance, it doesn't sit well sometimes in Unitarian Universalism because we're the church of the open doors, of the open minds, of the open hearts. That's what we taught our kids. We lead with love, not with boundaries. We don't do gatekeeping. And there is good wisdom to our resistance here because nobody wants a spiritual police force that cites and arrests anyone in the congregation found in violation of Section 3, 8, whatever. Indeed, many of us came to Unitarian Universalism to get away from the sort of high control religions. I respect that. The reality is we will always step on one another's toes because we're complex people in pluralist spaces. Yes, we share central values, but we also disagree on important issues, and thriving in a pluralistic space means that we will disagree with one another often. But love guides our disagreement. In fact, I would argue that UU spaces have more conflict because there's so much that we do agree on that we end up fighting about the 1% that's different, the implementation of the value. So covenant is what brings us back to the repair work that we do with one another when our disagreements stop being centered in love. Multiple times this week, I heard some version of this. I'm sorry. I'm very passionate about that. I realized that I got a little upset about that. Can we try again? That's covenant. Covenant is what keeps any one of us from taking over the playground. Now, for Star Trek fans out there, the paradox of tolerance does not mean that we are the Borg, always in agreement because we have only one collective brain. But it does mean that we speak up when there's a pattern of acting out over and over. So Karl teaches us what you wanted me to learn with Jonah, and I never did. If belonging in the choir matters, if the loving community is something covenantal and beautiful and worth protecting, Jonah needs to change his behaviors. I didn't have the voice of Yahweh in my ears. That was my excuse, but I knew I should have sailed to Nineveh and talked to Jonah. It's at this point that I think that you're thinking that the point I'm saying today is that covenantal communities need to get better at policing who's in and out. That's not it. We're 30 degrees off. In my experience, Unitarian Universalists need to get better at having the first conversation with Jonah. It would have sounded like this. Hey, I noticed you missed choir twice this week. Are you okay? Do you need support for something? Because as we have our covenant and we set our goals together, this isn't one of the ways to do it. That first conversation is the hardest one. It's the inflection point where you decide if you're going to do the thing you know you need to do, or are you going to dodge it? Are you going to sail to Nineveh or Tarshish? I'm one of the many polite Midwesterners who believes deep in my bones, despite all of my life's evidence, that if I'm just nice enough and inspirational enough and patient enough, then my Jonah will change his behaviors and attend rehearsals. I believed it for decades. I wonder if you can relate. It comes from a beautiful place, a commitment to see the beauty in the other person. But it also closes me off from hearing the voice in my head that says, Steve, you know what you have to do. But I don't want to be the bad guy. I want to be the loving guy, I keep saying to myself. Can I please just go to Tarshish? And when I started to learn how to have these loving accountability conversations to call people back into covenant, I hated it. I would lose so much sleep worrying about the various catastrophes that might happen. My stomach would turn, my throat would go dry. It's awful. I don't judge the prophet Noah for sailing to Tarshish. I did over and over for decades, continually shirking my basic responsibility as my student's teacher to help bring safety and dignity to the ensemble. It was only after I started engaging in these conversations that I finally realized the best part of the prophet Jonah's story. And it's the actual point I'm trying to make today. Jonah's not responsible for the Ninevites. The Ninevites are. He's just responsible for having the hard conversation. I was giving myself way too much credit, thinking that both sides of the conversation were mine to own. How arrogant. When I had these hard conversations with someone who's out of covenant, they're the one that's responsible for their behavior, not me, and likewise. Yes, our values do call us to see that everyone has inherent worth and dignity, but when I think I can fix them, I'm diminishing their value. I'm blaming and shaming them. I'm manipulating. I'm taking on their responsibility for them. Now, my student Jonah had the capacity, if I had had that conversation, to say, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I didn't think my absences were affecting the choir. He could have changed his behavior, or he might not have. But I never honored him fully as an adult to make his choice. Instead, I pitied him. When you tolerate a person's persistently harmful behavior, you expect so much less of that one person than you do of anyone else. When you try to fix or pity someone, you fail to love and respect them enough to take ownership of their actions. That first conversation with Jonah, had I sailed to Nineveh, it would have been an act of love. Jonah, I love you enough to say that right now you are falling short of our expectations and covenant. Now, if nothing changed, the second conversation would have still been grounded in love. Jonah, we're clear now that you are hurting this choir and we need to change course here. Do you choose to change your behavior, or do you choose to step away from this choir? If needed, a final conversation would have been an act of love. Jonah, I love you and I hope you will find your passion. You may end up being a great philosopher like Karl, but today your actions have chosen to leave this choir. It's our collective responsibility to build good, living, and loving covenants. And this, by the way, is not a sermon of finger wagging. This is a sermon of gratitude. Because when I was in search, this was the only conversation that had built its own covenant and reads it every week. Thank you. Each of us has that responsibility to participate in covenant. It's the community's responsibility to hold one another in love and dignity. And after all, as the prophet Jonah learns, albeit very reluctantly, sometimes people surprise you. It's hard to build belonging. We know what belonging feels like. We talked about that last week. That's the beautiful part. That's arriving just as you are, loving the other person just as they are, following that platinum rule, and being authentic in your space. But the work of building belonging is a step after the platinum rule. It forces you to ask questions like, what doesn't belong? What do we do when someone's actions hurt other people? How do we love everyone through a conflict that arises from these behaviors? Now, I don't want to assume, but I'm guessing many people here know exactly what avoiding a conflict feels like. And as Brene Brown points out, it spills over into shame and blame. I'm guessing you know that feeling. And we tell ourselves, I did for years, that I'm keeping the peace. But as Reverend Dr. King would point out, that's a negative peace. You're suppressing tension. True belonging is a positive peace. It's the presence of loving justice. This may be the hardest lesson for Unitarian Universalism. It may be the hardest thing I say up here. And I say that because it's been the most painful lesson in my life. It always feels awful when I have to address someone's hurtful behavior. But I've stopped lying to myself that my job is to fix that person. I've stopped imagining what could go wrong while ignoring what is going wrong. Beloveds, I sailed to Tarshish over and over again, continually finding myself in the belly of a big fish called shame and blame. I've done it too many times to count. But I can tell you that I discovered what it feels like to help build a community that honors its covenants and holds everyone in love. And to use the metaphor, that's a choir that sings gloriously. I'm telling you, when you let love guide you, singers will hurry to join that choir, even tenors. May it be so.